right? The parents speak Hebrew and the kids speak English. It's an immigrant generation, but it's a very moving ceremony. It's very lovely. You're all invited to come to that as well. And then, of course, on Mondays, Yom Ha'atzmaut. So there's lots of things going on in the community for that. Okay, yeah? There's a Parsha discussion today as well. Good. All right, welcome. I'm sorry about last week. I do apologize.
I'm not that sorry.
I know.
I'm sorry you're here now.
I know. You think he's enjoying his retirement? Yeah. You know, he gave up the pulpit and he said, "I don't have to do this anymore. I don't have to get up on Saturday mornings anymore. I don't have to be nice to people anymore." I said, look what happened, I'm telling you. You know, remember Bernie Lipnick? Bernie Lipnick was the rabbi in St. Louis, the conservative synagogue in St. Louis, and he retired, and the congregation gave him a Winnebago and 1,000 gallons of gas. No, that's a true story. That really happened. That really happened. You know, like gay gesundheit. Anyway, I'm sorry there was a scheduling mix-up between me and Rabbi Farkas, and I'm deeply grateful to Rabbi Gelman for stepping in. Thank you so much. Sort of like bringing Kershaw out of the bullpen. I mean, it's like, you know, Babe Ruth off the bench. You know, we need someone to teach. Oh, you know, world-class rabbi, get up here and teach. Thank you so much. It's really, really very sweet. I'll tell you what we're going to do for the next couple of weeks, partially because I'm not a real fan of Leviticus. Deuteronomy, I love Leviticus, and partially because this is a very auspicious time of the year in the Jewish calendar. There are 3 new holidays that were added to the Jewish calendar, and they fall within these next few weeks. Now, just to give you a sense of that, the last new holiday before Yom Ha'atzmaut that was added to the Jewish calendar was Hanukkah. The events took place in 166 BCE, and it was officially made part of the calendar by the Mishnah in 200. So, you know, you wait 1,700 years to add new holidays. Must be something going on. And it recognizes that the 20th century contained a series of events which were really earth-shattering for the Jewish people. So there are 3 new holidays. Yom HaShoah, the day that we remember the Shoah, the Holocaust. Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day, or Yom HaZikaron and Yom Ha'atzmaut. And then Yom Yerushalayim. Now, Yom Yerushalayim is not normally a big deal holiday, except that this year it's the 50th year. 50th year since the Six-Day War, since the liberation of Jerusalem. So we have these 3 new holidays that have been added to the calendar. And they are significant, and it's significant where they fall out. They don't fall out here quite by accident. Yom HaShoah was added because what happened was you have an event of the Holocaust which begins in, 1937 and ends in 1945, and you have to choose a day. Okay, so the United Nations chose the day that Auschwitz was liberated, which was back in April. But the Jewish community chose something else. The Jewish community called the holiday Yom HaShoah Ugvura, the day of destruction and heroism, and they chose the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, that was last week, last Sunday. Yom Ha'atzmaut, of course, is the day that Israel declares its independence after the United Nations vote in 1947, 1948. And Yom Yerushalayim is the day that the troops entered into Jerusalem. What's significant is that they fall right between Pesach and Shavuot. So here you have the 2 preeminent historical holidays of the Jewish people, Pesach and Shavuot. Now, to have holidays that base your faith in history is a very gutsy thing to do. Maimonides, remember Maimonides, that's the great 12th century Spanish philosopher, he didn't believe in history. For him, you learn of God by learning nature. He learned of God by learning the metaphysical and physical structure of the universe because he felt that was a much more stable foundation for faith. Because history can always be reinterpreted and history can always be reversed. But the Jewish people made a different choice. We chose to learn from history. So you take the Pesach holiday, and what does the Pesach holiday do? It brings us to an historic moment. And the historic moment that it brings us to is on the other side of the Red Sea. That's just before you eat supper, right? In the Seder. Just before you eat supper, you cross the Red Sea, and it's like, Gewalt! And you sing Dayenu. Because at that moment, we turned around and realized that Pharaoh wasn't chasing us anymore, and we were free. We were slaves, our parents were slaves, our grandparents were slaves, their parents were slaves. We had no hope yesterday of ever being anything but a slave, and all of a sudden, we wake up to discover that we're free. That experience of liberation, of redemption, is so earth-shaking for the Jewish people that we build a whole faith on it. This idea that there is a God who... Now it's getting cold in here. See what you did to me? I'm going to put all the menopausal women on one side of the room and all of the men with wool sweaters on the other side of the room. Good fuck. You build a whole faith on that idea because now you're going to posit that there's a God who has purposes in human history. A God who is guiding, shaping, or at least participating in human history, and that there are values, there are certain core convictions, freedom, dignity of human beings that some way or another will overcome the authoritarian impulses of human beings, the destructive impulses of human beings, that freedom can overcome slavery. This becomes the great historical faith of the Jewish people. No matter what happened to us afterwards, we kept saying, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. The process isn't over. The process is still going on, even if we can't see the evidence of the process right in front of us. Come on in, we've got plenty of room. So these are historical holidays, and Shavuot is a historic holiday of this one moment when the people of Israel meet God and form covenant. So what we end up with then is this season of the time when we're reflecting on what does history teach us. And then the 20th century comes along, and we have these events. And here's what I'd like to suggest to you. The greatest moment of destruction in the history of the Jewish people was the destruction of the temple in the year 70 by the Romans. That was the launching of what we call Judaism. The Holocaust matches it or exceeds it in its catastrophe. The greatest moment of redemption, of being saved, was Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt. Recreation of the state of Israel matches it or exceeds it. Problem is, Yetziat Mitzrayim and Churban Abayit, the exodus from Egypt and destruction of the temple, take place 1,500 years apart. 1,500 years apart. The Holocaust and the creation of Israel take place in one generation's experience. How the hell do you live with that? How do you live? How do you make any sense of that? How do you live with such gyration back and forth? The greatest tragedy and the greatest moment of salvation take place in one generation's experience. That is the task of our generation and subsequent generations, to figure that out. To figure that out. So, the Jewish people have given us holidays. First Yom HaShoah, first Pesach, and then Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, then Yom Ha'atzmaut a week later, and then Yom Yerushalayim a few weeks after that. And we're supposed to figure all this out. Like, what do you learn from it? I have a good idea of what we learned from Pesach, from the slavery and liberation from Egypt. What do we learn from Yom HaShoah? What do we learn from the Holocaust? And what do we learn from Yom Ha'atzmaut? What conclusions can we draw about the nature of our world? Now, one of the methods that I have used here, and as we've taught Torah, as we've learned Torah together, is to read Torah as myth. Now, myth has two meanings. Let's be really careful about this. The colloquial, the usual meaning of the word myth, with a small m, is something that's not true. Okay? Something that's not true. We say, I'll get political, but supply-side economics is a myth. You can cut everybody's taxes and eventually it'll pay for itself. Okay? That's simply not true, right? Ask Paul Krugman, right? But I'm using myth in a different way. The word myth with a capital M, used as a technical word in social science, means a fundamental truth expressed in the form of a story. A fundamental truth that's shared in a culture in the form of a story, a narrative. So in America, for example, we have a myth of the self-made man. That is, with perseverance and self-discipline and hard work and education and initiative, you can succeed in America. That is the fundamental myth of American capitalism. Right? We believe that. We tell our kids that. Why do I have to learn algebra? I'm never going to use it because someday you're going to become successful because you'll know how to, derive quadratic equations, right? No, it's true. This is the fundamental core myth of American entrepreneurship, right? It's one of our big myths, right? It's a fundamental belief that organizes our world, but it's expressed in the form of a narrative, right? Pesach is a Jewish myth. Not in the sense that it didn't happen. That's David Wolpe's problem. It is a fundamental myth because it organizes the way we look at our lives. Because we really do believe that some way, somehow, justice can prevail in a world. That might doesn't always make right. That some way, somehow, through the machinations of divine will, right comes to assume might. That's the myth of Pesach with a capital M. Right? Everybody got that? Yeah. So here's my question. And this is the question I want to ask this week and next week. What myths will we learn from the Holocaust and from the state of Israel? What truths will we learn from the Holocaust and the state of Israel? And it's very important because we have these holidays and we get very emotional over these holidays. We cry and we're moved, and it's good. I mean, that means these holidays touch us in a very deep way. But the question is, what truths come out of them? What are you going to tell the kids? What are you going to tell the kids? So I want to ask that today more about Yom HaShoah. I know we're a week late. And next week we'll talk a little bit about Yom HaAtzmaut. And I want to ask, what are the myths that we derive from these holidays? Is that clear? So let's take a look inside. I gave you a whole bunch of guys who reflect on this so that we can hear a conversation among them, okay? All right? The first one, this is a very early article. Did you not get one? Do we have any more of these, Douglases? Share them. Pass them around. Someone didn't get it. All right, so Harold wrote this piece early in his career, 1963. If you need one, hold your hand up so people can find you. We got some back here. We can share too. Rabbi Schulweis wrote this piece early, and he published it in a Jewish educational journal. And here's the question that he asks. He's very frank, and I think he states the question quite beautifully. So he talks about Axel Springer, who's a great German newspaper man, who takes his son to Bergen-Belsen every year, and he whispers to his son, I want you to know this truth about us, what we did, right? What we have done to the Jewish people. And then Schulweis says, can I do less with my son? And here he picks up this narrative, it's second paragraph. When it comes to telling the story of the years of atrocity, and tell it I must, to my children, my congregation, and my community at large, I am torn by ambivalence. On the one hand, I feel compelled to tell the terrible truth that we were witness to a nightmare of civilized criminality, to man's awful capacity to hurt and to destroy. On the other hand, I grow steadily uncertain not over the psychological need and moral obligation to remember those black years, but whether it's enough to stop there, whether it is sufficient to relate the disaster and end it there. As a father who must tell his children why, and what, and how this unspeakable outrage was visited upon his people, I find myself wondering, what am I doing to their morale, to their will to live as Jews in this world, to their trust and belief in God and man, to their moral strength? For after the lesson is over, the nightmare reviewed each year with greater detail and more evidence, I remain perplexed. Do I lay a terror upon their hearts, a stone of fear? Do I unwittingly cast the shadow of an undelivered punch across their destiny? So here's the question he's asking, and it's a really very sensitive question, and he's one of the very few in the Jewish community who had the courage to even ask the question. First of all, what story do you tell? And second of all, what are the moral implications of telling that story? What do you do to the child to whom you tell that story? So if I say to my kid says, Abba, what happened? Well, I can think of 3 or 4 different ways just off the top of my head of telling the story. This I know is an empirical fact. 6 million Jews, 11 million people were murdered. By whom? For what purposes? Could you say, well, a small group of lunatics hijacked a great European country and forced them to construct machines of death, and we ended up getting killed by those lunatics. That's story number one. Okay? Story number two, a great European country went insane. Went insane with hatred and rage and spread all over Europe, hunting down our people, trying to produce a final solution where they would murder us all, and they got awfully close. That's second. Here's the third one. Christian Europe, which has never loved us, which has always hated us, finally had the power to do what it's always wanted to do since its beginning: destroy the Jews in vengeance for deicide, or destroy the Jews out of their own rage and hate against us. That's the third story. Here's the fourth story. Ready? There's an Israeli song that came out right after the 73 war. The Israeli song was, Kol ha'olam negdenu. The whole world is against us. So the fourth way of telling the story might be, you know, kids, they hate us. The world is clearly divided between us and them. And they will always hate us. And we have to do everything we can to protect ourselves against them. Because they will never accept us. All we can do is protect ourselves from them. That's the way the world is. 4 stories. Which one's true? It depends on how you want to tell a story. Not only is which one true, but let's ask a different question. Let's ask the pragmatic question. What do you do to the kid by telling him each of these stories? See, if you tell the kid, for example, that 4th story, if you really believe that we Jews are the eternal victims of history, that there is no way ever to expunge anti-Semitism or to mitigate it in the world, and that we are perpetually the victims of history, and there's nobody in the world you can trust, because they're all eventually going to come get you. What was the Yiddish expression? Is scratch a goy, you find an anti-Semite. Right? If that's your philosophy, how do you live your life? Or alternatively, if you say that the Nazis were a small band of lunatics who hijacked a great European country, you look at the world through very different eyes, you see? So here's Schulweiss's question. And he wrote a much more pointed piece years later. In 1976, he published a piece which got him into huge trouble in the American Jewish community. It was called The Holocaust Dybbuk. Because by 1967, after the Six-Day War, that's when Holocaust stuff started really coming out. That's when the community, for some strange reason, when we were saved in 1967, that's when we started really paying attention to the Holocaust. And I don't know about you, but I was in Hebrew school when I was a kid, and I'll tell you what they did this time of year. They showed us movies, right? First they showed us that While 6 Million Died, which was like a CBS documentary, and then they didn't like what we weren't crying hard enough. So then they brought us a French movie called Night and Fog, which if it didn't make you cry, it means you have a heart of stone. It's just gore. I mean, it's a horrible thing. And then the problem was that we'd say, like, okay, yeah, but then the teacher said, and now we'll say Kaddish. Well, what do you learn from that, says Schulweiss? How do you look at the world after that? So Schulweiss is begging us to consider what is the moral effect of telling those stories? What conclusions do you draw? Just as a contrast, let's consider the following. You had a Pesach Seder, right? Probably had 2, God help you, right? Now, your Pesach Seder, you're remembering what? Their experience in Egypt, right? How many years were we slaves? Well, not 400, 280, right? How many generations were we slaves? 4 generations. How many generations experienced liberation? 1 generation. But you don't tell the story as the unmitigated horror of slavery. I'll give you a physical. You all have a Seder plate? You got one of these when you got married, right? If it's a fancy Seder plate, it has 6 things. If it's a cheap Seder plate, it only has 5. Okay? Of the 5 or 6 things on your Seder plate, how many are bitter? 1. Maror, or chazeret, maybe 2. Okay? Why only 2? Why only 1? We were slaves for a long time. Slavery was horrible. It was brutal. It was oppressive. It was humiliating. It was murderous. Why don't you have 6 portions of maror on the Seder plate? In fact, when you eat the maror, you don't even eat the maror as you should. You should take a mouthful of maror. If you're being Californian, you should have a jalapeno pepper. Stick the whole thing, or wasabi. A tablespoon of wasabi. Put it in your mouth and feel the tears of the slaves, right? You don't do that. What do? First of all, you use horseradish, right? And then what do? You drown it in charoset. Think about that for a minute. Why? Why aren't there? What is the meaning of only one of the 6 things on the plate being bitter? Because the story isn't the story of slavery. The rabbis who created our Seder intentionally underplayed, underemphasized the experience of slavery and overemphasized liberation. It's a holiday of liberation. Zman Cherutenu, not Zman Avdutenu. It's not Zman Avdutenu. It's not the time of our slavery. And it should have been. That would have been more historically accurate. But the rabbis were telling the story, and here's the thing. When you tell a story, you construct a history. And you construct a history deliberately in order to teach something. So what were they trying to teach? They were trying to teach the proximity of redemption. That redemption is close. That liberation is possible. A faith in the possibilities of human history. Now, using that as a model, we have to decide, what are we going to say about the Holocaust? Okay.
Well, I guess I'm a generation behind you in this, but I saw all those horrible movies as well. But having grown up in the Young Judean movement, it really all became about Zionism in the end. That all of these things happened, but now we have our own homeland.
Yes.
It's not going to happen.
Everybody hear that? Yeah. All right, so you grew up in Young Judea, right? And in Young Judea, as in all the Zionist youth movements, the last line was, and that's why we need our own country. Right? Even better than that. Anyone here remember, long ago, the original Yad Vashem in Jerusalem? It was this long, narrow building, and on one side of the wall was an historical diorama, sort of a timeline, of the story of the destruction of the Jewish people. That went along one side of the wall of the building inside. What was along the other side? The story of resistance. The story of the ghetto uprisings, the uprisings in the concentration camps. And if you had half a historical mind, you said, that's 6 million Jews, and that's about 8. What? Because the Zionists wanted to say, we're ashamed of that. We're ashamed of the passivity of the Jewish people, and we're proud of the Gevura. That's why it was Yom HaShoah Ugevura. We're proud of the resistance, and this is here to show you why there's an Israel, right? And then they change it. The new one, the new Yad Vashem, is very different, because Israel discovered in its maturity that there are different forms of resistance. That the ghetto mother who shared her ration of bread with her babies was not passive at all, but was resisting. That the ghetto family that went, or the family that went through the concentration camp, was resisting just staying alive and not giving up. Sandy.
Well, to celebrate, to commemorate both days, what Schulweis taught us was, amongst other things, he gave us Jewish World Watch. We just never forget and keep acting upon it to not forget and act upon and not let.
All right, hold that thought for 30 minutes.
Well, Jewish World Watch is what.
Yes, we announced that. I announced it.
I missed that, but also liberation. There's a concert in the auditorium tomorrow, which celebrates the journey from darkness to light.
Right.
So I just want to mention anybody who wants to celebrate liberation.
Good.
It's going to be a good concert.
Look at the last paragraph of Schulweis' statement, and then I want to go on to the next one. Wendy.
Sorry.
Don't be sorry.
Ahead of time, I'm sorry, excuse me, but I think there's one other.
Yeah, go ahead.
My,
There's lots of other archetypes.
my kid just went to Poland on the March of the
Yeah, she's in Israel now, right?
Yes.
Yeah, lucky kid.
She went, I don't know, Ed, I don't have the education. She went to the grave, the 800 children.
Yeah, there's a mass grave, yeah.
And that's when she called me.
Yeah, a lot of
Very
kids.
upset.
They structured the trip that way, yeah.
And so she didn't, I've always taught her what my buddy also taught me, you don't forget, always. But she said, how can people be like that?
Right.
And so here's the archetype that I know. I said to her, people are both things, Madeline. It's like in Jewish, like what Rabbi Feinstein taught you, I don't remember the Hebrew, the good part,
Yeah.
the dark part.
Right.
It's always about the choices, I'm a prosecutor and I've seen things I don't talk about.
Mhm.
But I've also seen acts of tremendous, and I know in my own heart I've done terrible things, but I've done good things. So I think that's one of the archetypes, one of the myths that also applies here.
Okay, good. Hold that thought, because we're about to see that thought. Yeah, you're right, but I want to show you people that look much better than you and me who are going to say that. So look at the last paragraph of Schulweis. Ready? Schulweis writes, memory is an ambiguous energy. That's a great phrase. It can liberate or enslave, heal or destroy. The use of memory carries with it responsibility for the future. How we interpret the Holocaust holds serious consequences for the character and morale of our children. See, if your kid comes back and says, this world sucks because if they can do this to Jewish children, there's nothing in the world that I'm going to do for this world. If your kid comes back and says, God damn the Goyim, right? I'm going to go live in Brooklyn among my own because the Goyim have no claim on me after they did this. If your kid comes back and says, I have moral license to act as a Jewish terrorist because look what they did to us, you and I will say you have drawn the wrong conclusions. You see? That your kid comes back and says, I realize the moral capacities of human beings to create evil and good in the world, and I commit myself to the good. I think that's a different interpretation of the same events. You see? You told her the right thing, right? Good. You're a good mom. Wendy, you're a good mom. I love you, right? Not only for Jewish children, but for non-Jewish child as well. Now, that's a really interesting question. So you take a non-Jewish kid and you tell him the Holocaust story. What are you telling him? What are you going to say to him? Right? We'll come back to that. I am therefore concerned with the reaction of Jews and non-Jews to the revelations of the Holocaust, how effective, how constructive has been our way of relating the atrocity. Now let's turn to the person who is most well known as an explainer of the Holocaust, Elie Wiesel. And I want to show you two versions of his response. The first is the early Wiesel, and the second is the later Wiesel. Wiesel, you remember, grew up in Szeged in Hungary. When he was 15 years old, his family was taken to Auschwitz. He was a Hungarian Jew, so they were the last deportation to Auschwitz. He spent a year in Auschwitz and was liberated, and then came to Paris, learns French, becomes a writer, marries, comes to America, teaches at Boston University, receives the Nobel Prize, becomes a world-class celebrity and a spokesman, and he passed away last year. Before he won the Nobel Prize, he was very accessible. I met him once in LaGuardia Airport. He was walking through the airport. I just thought, Professor Wiesel, you've touched my life. He was very sweet, right? After he won the Nobel Prize, it was harder to get to him because he became a world-class celebrity. It does it, you'll see, right? So when he's in Paris right after the war, he writes a memoir of his experience. It's 700 pages long. And he realizes that 700 pages, you can't say what he needs to say in 700 pages. So he cuts it down to 105 pages. And he publishes it as the book Night. Last week at Wilshire Boulevard, they read it out loud. They had Tom Hanks and other people, right? Here's one of the paragraphs of that book. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget the smoke. Never shall I forget little faces of children whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath the silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget that nocturnal silence which deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I am condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. That's a survivor. That's the depths of despair of a survivor. Now here's what's interesting about Wiesel. He marries. He has a son. He begins a life as a writer, a storyteller, a teacher. And some years later, as his son is reaching bar mitzvah, he writes another book called A Jew Today. Listen to this other Wiesel. Same guy, years later. Post-marriage, post-kid, bar mitzvah. Our people has lost many of its children. We are alone, terribly alone, and sad, terribly sad. We are entering even more difficult times. The era ahead of us will be critical, and yet, we owe it to our past not to lose hope. Say what you will, despair is not the solution, not for us. Quite the contrary. We must show our children that in spite of everything, we keep our faith in ourselves and even in mankind, though mankind may not be worthy of such faith. We must persuade our children and theirs that 3,000 years of history must not be permitted to end with an act of despair on our part. To despair now would be blasphemy, a profanation. Don't turn the page so quick. What's the difference between old Wiesel and new Wiesel, or early Wiesel and later Wiesel? Where did he get it from? Do you get it from the kid? Or does having the kid make you have to find it? Does he change? You see the remarkable contrast between these two voices? So I'd say to you, well, which one is the proper interpretation? Which should be our liturgy for Yom HaShoah? Okay, turn the page. You'll now hear two American philosophers echo this in a lot more words. Richard Rubinstein graduated the Jewish Theological Seminary with Harold Schulweis, same class, 1950. He has a PhD in philosophy and he goes to teach at the University of Bridgeport. In 1960, as the Holocaust is beginning to surface in American Jewish consciousness, and in 1961, when Eichmann is brought to Jerusalem for trial, he writes an essay and then he puts it into a book, which is not so much a philosophical essay as it is a scream. Just a scream at all of us. A scream at the American Jewish world, a scream at the Jewish world. Here's Rubinstein's shriek, his scream. I believe that the greatest single challenge to modern Judaism arises out of the question of God and the death camps. How can Jews believe in an omnipotent, that means all-powerful, beneficent, that means good, God, after Auschwitz? Traditional Jewish theology maintains that God is the ultimate omnipotent actor in the historical drama. It has interpreted every major catastrophe in Jewish history as God's punishment of a sinful Israel. So if you open the book of Jeremiah, the prophet in the Bible, Jeremiah knows that Nebuchadnezzar, the great Babylonian general, is coming to destroy Jerusalem. What does Jeremiah call Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar, he says, is the tool of God's wrath, punishing a sinful Israel. You have sinned. You have polluted God's temple. You have corrupted God's land. And Nebuchadnezzar is the tool of God's punishment coming to punish you. The rabbi said something similar. When the temple was destroyed, they said, why was it destroyed? And they say, Mipnei sinat chinam, as a punishment for the internecine hatred of the Jewish people. We do this to all of our tragedies. That's why we fast on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th day of Av, which is the day that everything bad happened to the Jewish people, is a fast day. Why is it a fast day? Bad stuff happened to us, so I can't have Rice Krispies in the morning? Why is it a fast day? Because the tradition understood that every one of these calamities was punishment for sin. And punishment for sin means I have to repent. And repenting means I fast. Tanit, I fast. Why didn't they put Yom HaShoah into Tisha B'Av? For this reason. Because here's Rubinstein's idea. I can't use that logic when I think about the Holocaust. I fail to see how this position can be maintained without regarding Hitler and the SS as instruments of God's will. To see any purpose in the death camp, the traditional believer is forced to regard the most demonic, anti-human explosion in all history as a meaningful expression of God's purposes. This idea is simply too obscene for me to accept. Right? Too obscene for me. By the way, there is one group of people in the Jewish people who does say that. If you want to, there is a group of guys in Jerusalem who are the ultra Orthodox, really Orthodox. And they call themselves Neturei Karta, guardians of the city. And they believe they live in the 14th century, except they have a website. But because they don't accept Israel, it's in English. And you can look them up. Google Neturei Karta. You'll get there, and they'll tell you why. You see, the Jewish people made a deal with God. We would not go back to Eretz Yisrael, and God would not let the nations of the world destroy us. We broke our side of the deal. The Zionists rose up and endeavored to bring the Jewish people back to Israel. So God says, I ain't protecting you anymore. So on the Neturei Karta website, you're going to find the next sentence very difficult to hear, but it's true. Herzl and Hitler are allies. Now think about this. They're both born in Austria, both moderns. Because of Herzl, you get Hitler. Hitler was the punishment for your Zionist. That's why they reject Zionism. Hitler was the punishment for your Zionist hubris. Your arrogance and pride, you see? That's the only group of people that I know in the Jewish world who will maintain this. You want to say something?
Wasn't another group other than Torah?
No, these are Satmar, but that's the same. They're buddies. They're intermarried. Right? It's a long story about Satmar. Don't get me started, okay? Because this is on tape and they're going to see it. They're not going to let me in. Now, what does he say? He likes, so he says, look, I can't believe that. But if I can't believe that, I have to let go of the whole idea of a God of history. And if I let go of a God of history, what am I left with? I'm left with the world that was described by the French writer Alfred Camus. Camus refuses to see man as inevitably and inescapably guilty before God. He accepts tragedy, the inevitability and gratuitous absurdity of suffering, but he refuses to consent to its justice. He would rather live in an absurd and different cosmos, in which men suffer and die meaninglessly, but still retain a measure of tragic integrity, than to see every last human event encased in a pitiless framework of meaning, which deprives men even of the consolation that suffering, though inevitable, is not entirely merited or earned. In other words, Camus says, I'd rather live in an empty, absurd, dark world than to think of a God who made a plan to kill us. We concur with this choice of an absurd, ultimately tragic cosmos. I bet his Seder table's fun. It is precisely because human existence is tragic, ultimately hopeless, and without meaning that we treasure our religious community. In it, we can and do share in a depth and dimension which no secular institution can match. What he says is what religion is about is holding hands in the darkness. So what does Rubinstein say? He says, how can you pray the same prayers? How can you have the same Seder? How can you live the same Jewish life you did before the war? You can't believe in the same things. And for him, the radical choice is either believe in that, which he finds obscene, or live in a, what was the word? This is a great phrase, right? It's like a Woody Allen movie. Tragic, ultimately hopeless, and meaningless world. Children, tonight we're going to celebrate the tragic, ultimately hopeless, and meaningless world we live in. Die, No, this is a serious question. This is what Schulweis is talking about. Schulweis and he, they did not get along, right? I mean, personally they got along, but Schulweis is like, what do you do to kids if you tell them that, right? You're going to go tomorrow morning and march against genocide. But if I believe that the universe is tragically absurd and utterly meaningless, why bother marching against genocide? Why bother doing anything moral in the world? Just live your happy life and tomorrow you die. Because if it's this is the moral question. Why should I sacrifice myself in any manner for anyone, for any cause, for any value if the universe is this way? So the answer, this sounds suspiciously like Wiesel number 1. The answer to Rubinstein comes from Emil Fackenheim 9 years later, in 1970. Emil Fackenheim, born in Germany, Reform rabbi, ordained Reform rabbi, very scholarly fellow, taken to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. Theresienstadt was not a death camp. It was a holding camp. It was the elite holding camp. It was the one they showed the Red Cross. So he never got taken to Auschwitz. He survived the war in Theresienstadt and came to Toronto after the war and finishes his PhD, becomes a teacher of philosophy in Toronto and a writer on Jewish issues, and then eventually makes Aliyah to Israel. In 1967, Fackenheim is just blown away by Israel's victory in the war. And he needs to respond to Rubinstein. So he writes a book. It's a teeny little book because he's not sure. When a philosopher writes a teeny book, it means he's not sure of something. When he writes a big fat book, anyway, he writes a teeny little book. It's called God's Presence in History. You hear the difference between him and Rubinstein right away? And this is what he writes. He says, I agree with Rubinstein. Nothing can be the same after the war. But not for what Rubinstein says. He says, I think God spoke to us at Auschwitz. I think Auschwitz is as revelatory an experience as Mount Sinai. A second Mount Sinai. In many ways, it's obverse, right? If Mount Sinai is this glorious moment of light, Auschwitz is this glorious moment of death. But we heard something from Auschwitz. What did we hear? A 614th commandment. There's 613 in the Torah. You guys have a 614th. This is going to be the dominant commandment of your life. What is it? What does the voice of Auschwitz command? Jews are forbidden to hand Hitler posthumous victories. Don't let him win. They are commanded to survive as Jews lest the Jewish people perish. They are commanded to remember the victims of Auschwitz lest their memory perish. They are forbidden to despair of man in the world, to escape into otherworldness or cynicism, lest they cooperate in delivering the worlds over to the forces of Auschwitz. Finally, they are forbidden to despair of the God of Israel, lest Judaism perish. Now that's going to mean something, right? A secularist Jew cannot make himself believe by a mere act of will, nor can he be commanded to do so. And a religious Jew who has stayed with his God may be forced into new, possibly revolutionary relationships with God. One possibility, however, is wholly unthinkable. A Jew may not respond to Hitler's attempt to destroy Judaism by himself cooperating in its destruction. In ancient times, the unthinkable Jewish sin was idolatry. Today, it is to respond to Hitler by doing his work. Now, let me ask you, is that a reasoned argument or an emotional argument? I don't know. Is it a reasoned argument or an emotional argument?
It's a false argument.
Why?
Because all of these reactions are based upon a theological assumption that's wrong.
Okay, which is?
Which is that God is supposed to reward the righteous and punish the wicked.
Okay.
And that the triumph of Hitler had nothing to do with Western nations passively accepting the rise of fascism in Europe and its ultimate consequences. That has nothing to do with God. It was, I think, really Wiesel who made a whole theological, some would argue, business out of the idea that is really simple in its root. There is no theological issue here. Because human beings, and Wiesel understood this even in a moment.
Finish the sentence.
The question is not where was God.
Yeah.
The question is where was man.
Okay.
Once you take that turn, and once you understand that this is about the failure to prevent the rise of fascism,
Okay.
and that's a human failure, not a divine failure,
Okay.
the whole thing changes, your view of it changes.
But
All right.
Rabbi, why should I sit then in temple and all the prayers tell me that God is overweening, and I should worship him, and he'll take care of me. That's,
Okay.
Well, because God has given us the choice.
he doesn't say that in the prayers, that's
He
why I don't
does,
know.
absolutely. Deuteronomy's full of choose life. Choose, I have set before you life and death.
Okay.
Choose life. We chose death. We could have responded in 1941. We didn't, in 1933 when he took
We're
power.
not talking about historical.
All right, so Mark, so her question is, so if you adopt that paradigm, which is tempting, by the way, because it does in some ways solve the problem, right? But then you have this whole historical literary tradition. That's what Wendy's arguing about, which mitigates otherwise. You know, b'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu v'chalotenu v'akodesh baruch hu matzilenu miyadam. And you said that in your Seder. In every generation, they rise up, but God smacks them down and saves us. So,
But the other tradition, alive and real
Yeah.
in the rabbinic world,
Yeah.
is Ben Azah.
okay,
Schar mitzvah. The reward of a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself.
okay,
Which means that
Hang on.
acting so that we're building up an account that will require God to protect us
Yeah.
is childish.
okay. Okay, so here is, so I'm gonna be a fascist about this. I'm gonna. Here is a different take on Rabbi Gelman's philosophy at the bottom of the page. Yitz Greenberg, Rabbi Irving Greenberg, who's a friend of ours, who's been here. He came for Rabbi Schulweiss's 80th birthday. He gave a lesson, right? And I edited it. And I put it in my book. This is my book. And the reason I like this book is because when Greenberg read it, he said, that's what I meant to say. Good. How can we talk about God again after the Holocaust? He says you can't. You can only recreate the image of God. We'll come back to the idea, right? And you can recreate it like you can recreate yourself. The next step for the Jewish people is to take power. Listen to what he says. The real issue is not where was God in the Holocaust, but why didn't God stop the Holocaust? Rubenstein, whom I admire, had the courage to say God is dead. But if you don't believe that, what do you answer? Here's Greenberg. I believe the answer is that God was saying, I'm not going to save you. This is tzimtzum, divine limitation. That's where he differs from you. I believe the answer is that God was saying, I'm not going to, the answer is that God was saying, I'm not going to save you. I'm asking you to stop the Holocaust. You are human, a partner in the covenant. Take responsibility. Taking power is the fundamental transformation, it should say, of our religion now. We can no longer be a religion that says God will save you. God's own message is that you have to take responsibility. If there was ever a time for God to intervene miraculously during the Holocaust, if God didn't do so, he must have intended for us to take responsibility. The Jewish people overwhelmingly understood that. So what did we do at the end of the war? Be right with you, Michelle? One second. What did we do at the end of the war? We couldn't believe in that God of history anymore, so we became that God of history. What does God do in the world? God saves. So what did we do? We went out and saved, right? The Jewish people saved Soviet Jewry, we saved Jews from Arab lands, we saved Jews from Ethiopia, right? What does God do in the world, right? God teaches justice. So we went out and tried to create liberal societies that were tolerant. What does God do in the world? God teaches Torah. So we create, think about how many synagogues and seminaries and summer camps and federation institutions were created since the war. What Greenberg is saying is that the lesson is it's now yours. That's the switch. And this is an Orthodox rabbi, by the way. And he goes to the Federation world. I was there the first time he did it. It was amazing. And he says to the Jewish Federation world, you're doing holy work. Because if you are acting in the image of God, even if it's not prayer and mitzvah, you are doing what God needs done in the world. You are doing holy work.
So why do you keep
Wait. That's, I just want you to, so we have,
that you choose to say this one?
we have two different versions then of this same philosophy of removing God from history, you see? Okay, yeah.
So my nephew was just inducted into the Israeli army.
Mazel tov.
Thank you. And he was given his gun and the Tanakh
Yeah,
on that day.
Yeah.
So to me, that kind of says it all. This is your moral code and your marching orders.
Yeah.
Make it happen. And that's also why during the Seder, we say that the whole idea that the come who's hungry is said in Aramaic, it's a language not understood by the angels, because that's our deal.
Yeah.
Like, we are responsible.
Now you become, and Schulweis is going to do a similar kind of thing. Schulweis and Greenberg are very close together, even though they start from very different places. So for Schulweis, I know, I see it. For Schul, I know. Schulweis is going to say that you can't believe in a God who runs history, but you can act in a godly manner and embody those godly values, and that in itself is an expression of sanctity. Yes, please.
Why cannot we accept that God is still in the picture? Because a lot of Jews, including my sons, their sole existence is there because of Holocaust. Their grandparents were Holocaust survivors.
Right.
And my kids,
Yeah.
I don't correspond there. If it didn't happen, my kids wouldn't exist.
Yeah. The problem you have is that if you say, I still believe in a God who lives in the world and who has power in the world, you have to say, then how do you understand why that God did not involve God's self in this event? And if you say either God didn't want to or couldn't, or Jews learn their faith from history, and if you try to learn faith from this event, it leaves you in a very, very dark place. That's why. You see? That's the question. Stephen.
Okay, and you were talking about the Jewish people are supposed to save. And we do, but there's another power we were given, and that's to save ourselves, literally, and in Israel. And you were talking about the 6-Day War.
Yeah.
And I remember, and you brought that up, on the Zionist part, to give us power instead of passivity. And I'm not being funny with this. It was a real joke that went around in 1967. I recall it perfectly, and it gave us pride, and it gave us strength, and it gave us hope. And here's what the joke was during the 6-Day War.
Yeah.
Did you hear about the 10 Egyptian battleships that attacked an Israeli rowboat? They all got away.
Right.
That was that was great.
Right. So 1967, if you remember the lead up to the war, there was this terrifying sense that it's all happening again. Except this time there was television, so the whole world could watch it happening again. And this time we had a country, and we had a seat in the United Nations. And we sent the most articulate, urbane diplomat the Jewish people ever created, Abba Eban, to the United Nations, who stood in front of the United Nations and begged them, don't let this happen again. And the United Nations paid no attention to him. So what happens then is that Israel launches, a preemptive strike and destroys all of these Arab armies and completely changes the way that the world sees us and sees Jews and sees Israel. Right? Before the 6-Day War, I used to get beat up in gym class every single day. After the 6-Day War, they didn't touch me anymore. I was excuse the expression in a shul, a badass Jew. Right? Before the 6-Day War, the image of Jews was davening, rabbis with long old beards. After the 6-Day War, the image was Moshe Dayan, badass Jew. Now today, it's Bar Rifa'eli, right? We're making moral progress, right? And what happened is after the war, but here's what was so odd. This is this we have to think about. It wasn't until after the 6-Day War, when we narrowly escaped, and we changed our image, that's when the Holocaust became visible to Jews. Up until 1967, there's very little teaching, speaking. This is what Rubinstein's screaming about. Except for the trial of Eichmann, very little. It was only after the war that you began to see Holocaust memorials, Holocaust museums, all this kind of. Now it's this huge. All right, we have 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes left. Turn the page. Yes, please.
Isn't Kaplan's interpretation of Judaism and God's world of Judaism what you're referring to, in that it's not God, but it's all people, and then you could accept some limited role for God, but basically it's our position.
It's not Kaplan. Kaplan was one of the people who articulated such a philosophy, but Mordechai Kaplan's philosophy was built on 19th century progress. And he had no way of accommodating the horrible radical evil of the world. Really, this is an expression, it's stuff that you find in the tradition. You can find it in the Bible, you can find it in the Talmud, but it really was a certain set of modern philosophers. Kaplan was sort of their teacher, but not really the guy who articulated it. Schulweis, if anybody, articulated it best. This notion, and then Greenberg, right? This notion of human responsibility as the presence of God in the world. Either a God who withdraws from the world, the way Greenberg puts it, or the whole notion that the idea that God is running things as being wrong, which is what Schulweis basically says, right? It's what Rabbi Gelman articulated a moment ago, and putting the responsibilities squarely on human beings, right? Schulweis' argument was that human action in the world is the presence of God in the world. That's godliness, right? I want to take one more look at and this is an introduction to what we're going to do next week. So 1982, the state of Israel invades Lebanon, remember? Because there were all these incursions over the border, and Begin wanted to root out all the terrorist forces that were in the north, and he invades Lebanon, and the United States, the United Nations tells him, don't cross the Litani River, and Menachem Begin, you never tell Menachem Begin not to do something. So of course he not only crosses the Litani River, he goes all the way to Beirut, and the Israelis entrench themselves in Beirut, which is a whole other story. And for the first time, Israel is really a powerful country fighting a war that wasn't a defensive war in the same way that 67 or 73 was. And there's a lot of criticism. And in response to the criticism, Menachem Begin makes a very famous speech. And in the speech he says, Yasser Arafat, hiding in the cellars of Beirut, is Adolf Hitler hiding in the cellars of Berlin. And this time, we're going to get the son of a bitch. That's what he said, basically. And he equates the two. And who are you, the world, who stood by while we were slaughtered and didn't do anything to stop it? Who are you to criticize us? And David Hartman, Orthodox rabbi, living in Israel, teaching at the Hebrew University, this bothers him a lot. And he writes a very important piece. This is not the whole piece. This is only an excerpt. This is the best thing David Hartman ever wrote. It was an editorial column in the Jerusalem Post. And he asks a fundamental question. Should Auschwitz or Sinai be the orienting category shaping our understanding of the rebirth of the state of Israel? And I would ask the question slightly differently. Should Auschwitz or Sinai be the orienting event that should shape our Judaism? What are the implications of building an entire Judaism based on a 614th commandment from Auschwitz? And what's the downside of that? And what are the implications of building it based on a different model, say Sinai? And this is a very interesting question. If you take Fackenheim seriously, you say, okay, there's a commanding voice of Auschwitz that comes from the... Is that really the Judaism I want to hand to my kids? An Auschwitz-oriented Judaism? And what are the implications of that? So Hartman is going to ask this question, and he's going to ask it very powerfully. He said, I respect the memory of those destroyed. I respect the suffering. I respect it completely. But, go down about 6 paragraphs. I'm going to do this very quickly, right? It is a serious mistake to allow the trauma of Jewish suffering to be the exclusive frame of reference for understanding our national renaissance. Israel is not only a response to modern anti-Semitism, but it is above all a modern expression of the eternal Sinai covenant that has shaped Jewish consciousness throughout the millennia. It was not Hitler who brought us back to Zion, but rather belief in the eternal validity of the Sinai covenant. One need not visit Yad Vashem in order to understand our love for Jerusalem. Whenever a foreign leader comes to Israel, the first place they take him is Yad Vashem. That's still today, by the way. And what Hartman is saying, really? Is that really what you want to say? Do you really want to say, we have all of this only because of that? Or do you want to say something different? We have all of this because, and if you go down a little bit, the model of Sinai awakens the Jewish people to the awesome responsibility of becoming a holy people. You see, because Auschwitz tells you we have to have power, and we have to survive, and we have to be tough, and we can't be naive, and we can't believe that anyone's going to rescue us. We're the only, and those are legitimate points. But if that's all you say, you're going to become a rather brutal society. Because anytime you make a mistake, or anytime you do something brutal, you're going to say, you can't criticize us because you weren't there when we were in trouble. Sinai adds another element, which is we are a people of moral aspiration, a people reaching to become a holy people in a holy land and a holy society. We have moral dreams of the way the world ought to be. And to be reaching for those moral dreams is an intimate part of our identity. And frankly, says Hartman, that's a more important part of our identity, than the Auschwitz memory. Because the Auschwitz memory will always bring you back to a sense of suspicion because it's rooted in a sense of victimhood. And when you define yourself as a victim, you create a certain kind of personality. Only a person who's a person reaching for a moral vision, a moral ideal, is going to live up to what the Sinai community tells us, covenant tells us. At Sinai, we discovered the absolute demand of God. We discovered who we are by what we do. Sinai calls us to action, to moral awakening, to living constantly with the challenge of building a just and moral society which mirrors the kingdom of God in history. Sinai creates humility. He's talking about Begin's chutzpah and openness to the demands of self-transcendence, reaching beyond what we are now. In this respect, it is the antithesis of the moral narcissism that can result from suffering and viewing oneself as a victim. This got him into huge trouble. People really didn't like this. Because what he's basically saying is, yes, we're the product of a horrible atrocity, but that's not the totality of our identity. That's not who we are, right? That's not who we are. We are a people with a moral ideal in the world, right? You're going to get Shavuos coming. That's this moral ideal of the world as it ought to be, right? Look at the very bottom now, right? Sinai requires of the Jew that he believe in the possibility of integrating the moral seriousness of the prophet with realism and political judgment of the statesman. You can't simply say, it's tough running a country, so we're allowed to do whatever we want. Sinai keeps telling you the purpose of this country is to show the world that we can put Jewish ethics and Jewish moral vision into reality. It is to integrate Jewish body and Jewish soul, the Jewish heart with the realities of living in the world. That's the great gift of Israel, says Hartman. This paper caused a lot of consternation, as you can imagine. And that's what we're going to begin next week. Okay? Next week, I'm going to ask you the following questions. So I'm going to give you homework. You ready? You can go to pretty much any synagogue in America, and stand up in the middle of the service and declare out loud that you don't believe in God, you don't believe in prayer, you don't believe in the truth of the Torah, and you think all rabbis are frauds. And nothing will happen to you. Except the lady sitting behind you will ask you to move over because she'd like to hear the bar mitzvah girl. You go to pretty much any synagogue in America, and you stand up and say, you don't believe in a Jewish state of Israel. You believe it should be given to the Arabs. They will kill you before you reach the exit door. How come? And if your kid says to you, it sounds like the Pesach Seder, right? Bayom ahu, v'igata lebincha. In that day, you will say, your child will say, Mom, why are you going to Israel instead of Hawaii? Why Israel? And you say, well, it's our homeland. And you say, no, Tarzana is our homeland, says the kid. And you say, our people are there. You say, no, our people are here. And you say, well, it's important to us. And your kid says, but you don't speak its language, you don't read its newspapers, you don't know its music, you don't watch its films. How is it important to you? And you'll say, well, it's a place to run in case. And the kid will say, Mama, if America ever turns against us, Israel doesn't have a chance. What do you say to your child when your child says, what does Israel mean to you? Today we've talked about what the Holocaust means to us. And we saw the tension between the two Wiesels, which is reflected in Rubinstein and Falkenhayn. Next week, I want to ask you that question. And what does Israel mean to you? Okay? That's your homework assignment. See you next week.